everybody, welcome back. It's 3 o'clock UK time, so good afternoon to those of you who are this side of the Atlantic, and good morning still, I think, just to those of you who are joining us from Canada. I know we have people in Japan, we have people in New Zealand, so it's very much a global audience. So whatever time of day it is for you, welcome. My name is Liz Mosley and I'm hosting this session, the third of our Future City Summit, where we're going to have another go around and go a little bit deeper on this question of housing. And of course, housing has come up already in both of the sessions we've had. We've talked about inequality, and we've touched on the idea of how we would build cities that don't benefit, for example, the rich at the expense of the poor, or the young at the expense of the old. When I did A-level geography more years ago than I care to remember, the case study of poor inner city housing that I think we were all made to do, those of you who did A-levels, was the case study of knocking down the tenements in Glasgow and putting up the cities in the sky, the big 60s tower blocks. And we talked a lot about how in that particular classic example of sort of British failed, I think it's fair to say, urban design, it was where the house part was placed at the centre of a way of thinking about how people lived in cities at the expense of the people part. And that the house is only one part of a very complex system of how a community, a family and a city works. This word that I hadn't heard very much before we started preparing for this event, livability, the livability of those big 60s tower blocks just didn't work, quite apart from the quality of the execution of the flats that people were made to live in. Now, of course, we are here today for the Future City Summit looking for the beginnings of some ideas and some solutions, but we're a newsroom, and so we're also looking for stories, and sometimes to find the stories, you just have to change a little bit the way you look at the question. So I'm going to try and do something a little bit different in this session to begin with, before we really focus in on this question of urban planning and architecture and how architecture can be used as a tool for activism. My colleague Zav is in the chat, so please do weigh in, as you have been all along, with your clever thoughts and ideas and suggestions, and challenge us as we go. If I can, I'm going to start with Nanjala Nayabolo, who is joining us from, are you in Kenya, Nanjala? So we've got to keep our fingers crossed for your internet connection.
I am.
Hello, lovely to see you. Thank you so much for being here. And
yeah, we do. Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's publication day for you. Your book, is it out today? That's so exciting.
Not today.
Nanjala's book, Traveling While Black, is a sort of the latest, I think, in a lifetime of traveling all over the world. And your work, Nanjala, it really sort of, it's often reflections on, I think, belonging and who belongs where, and who feels they belong where, and how, if you don't feel that you belong, what that might do to you. And I just wonder if you might sort of open the bidding for this session on inequality by talking a little bit about your travel stories and experiences in cities all around the world. Even though our focus today is sort of UK cities and Canadian cities, you know lots about all manner of cities, and they work in very different sort of ways. They're sort of organisms of their own. How do people adjust to when they find themselves having to live in an urban environment that might be hostile to them? What's the impact of them? How do they make it work?
So my book focuses essentially on human mobility and travel, and some of it is personal experience, and some of it is, looking at broad strokes of how human mobility intersects with modern life. Restrictions on freedom of movement, restrictions on asylum, restrictions on refugee status. And cities are actually a big focal point of some of these conversations, because in a lot of cities, and especially in a lot of European cities, there's a little bit of tension between how these big capitals especially, but large cities more broadly, view migration and view human mobility, and how maybe the people who have power in those countries view those things. So for example, London is a great example of this. London is one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And that multiculturalism is what makes London vibrant, is what makes London a hub for creativity, for finance, for all of that stuff. And the tension between the growing restrictions on refugees and migrants, but in more general, is really at tension with the soul, the life and soul of what makes London unique and what makes London great. The fact that you have this broad mix of people bringing in different foods, different histories, different perspectives. And I think the idea that only wealthy people should have the freedom to come into our cities, the idea of making restrictions on migration, connecting them to wealth and connecting them to prosperity, I think is really detrimental to the life of a city. I think that's how you end up with situations like what you have in London, where you have entire tower blocks that have been purchased by wealthy people who have no intention of living there, but are actually just using them as investment properties. When in fact, providing affordable, safe urban housing, is actually, look at the lives that London lost in the Grenfell Tower fires, and look at the creativity and the passion and the varied experiences that was lost through that tragedy, through that failure to invest in providing safe and decent accommodation for working class families. So what I found in my experience, and in my book, I talk about Port-au-Prince, I talk about Nairobi, I talk about Palermo in Sicily, I talk about all of these cities, is that cities really can provide us with a roadmap towards thinking more inclusively about human mobility. And there is challenges in that. A lot of cities do have like this exploited underclass. And you see, this is the people who are dying the most of the COVID-19 are nurses who have no choice but to go to work, bus drivers who have to go to work, people who have to go to keep the gyms open, people who have to go and keep the restaurants open. There's definitely an element of inequality that is embedded in the success of some of the biggest cities in the world. And that's something that also needs to be addressed in the conversation. I hope that what I've done in my book is I've tried to give people a starting point to think about how a city can both be a solution and contribute to some of these tensions that we're seeing about how people move in the modern age.
Thanks, Nanjala. I wonder if this is an unfair question. I'm going to ask it anyway. I hope you forgive me. You've visited a heck of a lot more cities of the world than I have. I'm not a well-traveled person. It's really hard for me to conceive of a modern city that isn't unequal in some way. It's really hard for me to imagine what a properly inclusive city that's safe for everybody, where everybody's housed, because my experience of London, of Manchester, of Edinburgh, of New York, these are the cities I probably know best, they're all about inequality almost. They're built on inequality. Do you have a contradictory example that would make me feel more optimistic about the possibility of that?
I've not experienced anywhere that has nailed it. I've not experienced anywhere that has sort of overcome everything and everybody's happy and everything is sort of in order, because inequality, and I don't think it's necessarily tied to the city. I think it's tied to the socioeconomic processes that make cities necessary. I think it's really about economics. I think that in countries where people have thought more completely about inequality more broadly, about places where people have thought about providing safe housing for everybody, about making sure that work is safe and dignified, etc. And countries that are moving in that direction, you certainly have a little bit less of the tension that we're seeing in a lot of the big cities, whereby the logic of the economic prosperity of the city, the fact that you need this rich people to, keep the high-end stores open and high-end restaurants, things like that, means that there has to be an exploited underclass. And I think of how, like, when I went to New York, I was in New York a couple of years ago, and I was going to a job interview, so I had to get my nails done. And I went into a nail salon, the first one that I found on coming out of the bus station. I was like, oh, here's a nail salon. And migrant workers from all across Southeast Asia, I wouldn't be able to tell you which country. And then at the end of the service, she says, it's $10. And I thought, I don't even pay that in Nairobi. Like, even in Nairobi, I would not be paying that little to get my nails done. But the fact of the way in which the city is structured is that exploited underclass is what makes it possible for wealthier people to save money, to be able to buy, luxury goods and things like that. So I'm reluctant to say that it's embedded in the logic of the city per se. I think it's embedded in the economic structures around which modern life and cities are built. And so we have to start thinking about even like people talk about Scandinavia, and I think about, Denmark's, Copenhagen's policy, ghetto policy, quote unquote, about corralling, Somali migrants, and the world, there is a group of people that is living that reality of exploitation and inequality.
Thanks so much, Nanjala, and congratulations on your book again. Treat yourselves. I haven't read the book; it is only out today, but I've read an excerpt from it, and she writes beautifully. So I heartily recommend it. I'm going to come now to Mayor Stewart, if I can, Mayor Kennedy Stewart, who is with us. You're the Mayor of Vancouver, because Mayor Stewart, you have sort of built a political career with affordable housing and fair housing sort of in the middle of it, and Vancouver has a sort of certainly I hope some sort of positive examples of things that can be done to make the situation better. It's a very expensive place to live. Those of us who live in London are very familiar with what it's like to not be able to afford to live in the place where you are. I just wonder if you might sort of crack open this a little bit before we talk to Gregory about on the architectural side, to sort of talk about what happens when you put affordable housing in the centre of your sort of campaigning and policy making and political engagement.
Thanks so much. Thank you for hosting this. I think it's a very important discussion. I caught some of your previous panel and saw David Miller there, the former mayor of Toronto, who I talk with regularly. First, I want to say, acknowledge that I'm on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and thank them for their generosity for all who live on their lands. I didn't really put affordable housing at the center of my campaign. The public did. Is that in Vancouver, it's very, very expensive to live here. We've tried multiple solutions to address this problem, and I think we're making some headway through innovative policy. I really think if you're a mayor of a city, you have to. I was an academic for a long time, and then a member in our national parliament. Where it's a lot of theoretical discussion, but on the ground here in cities, it's really nuts and bolts. So you have to look at what you start with. And Vancouver, we're really densely populated. We have, just over 300,000 homes here in the city, 92% of which are in private hands, and 99% of the value of all our residential homes are in private hands. So we have very, very little public housing. That's because we're such a young city, and we just happen to be created when the federal government didn't really invest in housing. So we have no old stock. So then you have to understand kind of that context. So really there's not a lot of national investment in public housing. So really my approach has been to try to bend the market, to try to squeeze as much affordable housing as I possibly can out of the private sector developers. And so for example, we have one new program here. When somebody builds a rental, rental building, perhaps up to 20 stories tall, we have a program where 20% of that is of the units in that building are affordable to people making low and middle incomes, 30% of their income. But we've made sure they're locked, that those rents are locked in for the life of the building. We didn't think that developers would go for this, but they have. It's been, so we've approved 10 of these buildings now. And what that means is a retail clerk can live in the neighborhoods in which they work. And a lot of these buildings are now going in the richest parts of our cities. So, but it's slow going. But I do think that's really the only way that we can make progress on this file in terms of having these neighborhoods that work for everybody, is to try to innovate in policy, but actually get away from the theoretical discussions and try new things as quickly as possible to see if they work, and then share that information with other cities. So yep, it's housing here all the time. Even through COVID, the polling I see still puts housing as the top issue in the minds of Vancouverites.
It's fascinating because it is an urgent problem. It's an urgent problem here. It's an urgent problem for you. And it feels to me, from a complete layman's perspective, that some of the instances when well-intentioned urban housing sort of policies have gone wrong is when the urgency has forced through poor decision making or cheap or not very good quality or whatever. So you say it's a long game. It's slow going was your language.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you think all the time about how can we do this faster, but is the reason why you can't push it faster because you worry about the quality compromise of doing it faster?
Well, part of the reason why I can't move it faster is because we're kind of strapped to capital. Is that we have very little national and provincial level investment in housing. That's changed a little bit, but you have to work with the capital that you're kind of hostage to. So you have to negotiate with the international developers that build large buildings that can move their capital all over the place. And that's sure they can build condos, market rate condos or market rate rental buildings less frequently. But if you're going to try to bend their investment to essentially offer less profit for them to provide better rents, that's extremely difficult. And that's really just middle income housing. If you look at housing for the most vulnerable, that has to be straight up government investment, and that is extremely difficult to get. So really you have to just mobilize your community to, lack of a better term, pound the crap out of the other levels of government so they will invest in public housing. So you're leading a campaign on the ground to inflict pain on senior level politicians that ignore this problem.
And why do they ignore the problem? Is that just a ludicrous question to ask?
It's really expensive to build public housing. And then, of course, that's just the capital side of things. We have an overdose epidemic here in Vancouver. I'm losing one resident a day to our poison drug supply here. It's laced with fentanyl. 99% of our drugs are laced with fentanyl. And so, it's not just building a box in which people live, it's providing the wraparound services for this community that are suffering with mental illness and addiction. So, the national governments tend to like to build something and they run away from it, leaving our provincial governments here, equivalent to a state government, dealing with all the healthcare really that's attached. So there's a lack of agreement between the two levels of government. But still, as a mayor, you're just plodding ahead with trying to cobble together, the next building with the next round of services, and that's that's kind of the job. So that's why you have to wake up every day, and that's what I'm focused on, trying to make sure that the most vulnerable and those middle income folks that are being driven out of the core city can live here for decades to come. But it's not an easing task.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much, Mayor Stewart. And we may well come back to you shortly. And if there are people listening who are Vancouver residents who have a question or a thought or an observation, then please do weigh in the chat. I'm going to come now, if I can, to Kennedy Enriquez. You're a multi-award-winning architect. So really, I want to talk to you. You sort of sit at the apex of these things about livability, about sustainability, about community, and of course about the house itself, the bricks and mortar or whatever it's made from. Thank you so much for being with us today. I may be unusual and maybe I'm behind the curve, but I don't think of architecture as a tool for activism, but that is very much sort of how you have come at your discipline and the projects that you've delivered to be both sustainable and kind to the people who live in them. That's a sort of lens, for a sort of rendering of social justice in buildings. Would you talk to us a little bit about some of the projects that you've worked on and how you've made them work and why you can make a difference with the tool that you have, architecture?
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine, thank you.
I just want to begin by saying to Kennedy Stewart, you're doing an amazing job, and the city's better off with you as mayor. I want to say, I just want everyone to know internationally that we're very blessed to have him as our mayor. And I liked the grassroots sort of way you spoke. I think it's true. We're on the ground every day, one building at a time, trying to do the right thing. And architecture, just so everyone understands, like you're right, traditionally is form giving. It gives expression to society's values. It doesn't traditionally lead, it follows, right? So like everyone else on this panel, I'm just another person. And we as citizens have a responsibility to have an ethical component to our dimension in our daily lives and the way we participate in democracy. And so as an architect, you have a skill set. And if you can use that skill set to somehow further a more inclusive society, then it's a good thing. And so what we've done in our little practice is try and advocate for those who have less than. And we do it through many different vehicles, everything from little villages in Banbasari in Nepal, where we're helping people get housing, through to $3 billion redevelopments like Oak Ridge, where we're including hundreds and hundreds of units of social housing that will be gifted to the city through the mechanisms that Kennedy Stewart talked about. And so I have nothing but respect for everyone who weighs in on this important issue. But everyone has to remember that architecture isn't the solution, it's the vehicle through which we articulate society's values. And so this is really, really important. And I can give all sorts of ways in which it works. And the way in which it works the best is when there's real civic engagement and all citizens feel they have a voice in the making of the planning of our cities. And it sounds very simple, but it's done through mechanisms like we have the West End Plan. But prior to Kennedy Stewart, there was a previous mayor who put together a West End Plan. Because the citizens in that neighborhood were all at arms on a project that I was working on, where I was trying to build rental housing in a neighborhood where we just assumed it was a good idea. And everyone was up in arms about us doing the very first rental housing projects. And the civic, and the result was a new West End Plan, which has inclusive zoning at its very core. And when we legislate inclusive zoning into our zoning map, is when we start to facilitate real meaningful change long-term, because it's an expression of not only society's values, but of what people have to deal with in terms of the economics of the valuation of that land, and the way in which future councils and future have to deal with the making of our city. And so we have some very good examples in Vancouver. And I don't know, I think my favorite one is the Woodwards redevelopment that we worked on, where all levels of government came to bat. And this is where Kennedy is right again. If we have federal funding and provincial funding, and the city throws in the land and everyone works together, we can do amazing things. If we partner with NGOs, community groups, and bring in an enlightened developer, things can really happen. And Vancouver is probably one of the most privileged places on the planet in terms of economic potential. So we have the ability to do it better than most. I think the harder part is to talk about in disadvantaged places that don't have capital coming to those cities. How do you deal with those same core values in those places? And that's something that we believe we'd like to participate in and are trying to help in other places as well. Is that good to start off with, Liz?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much, Reggie. There's a lot to think about in there, and I'm going to come back in a second to Mayor Kennedy, because there's a question about a specific situation in Vancouver that some of us in the UK and other places might not be aware of, that Donna House has asked a question about that I think is helpful, perhaps as a sort of case study, if you like. But I can see that Leslie Kern has joined us too, and thank you so much, Leslie. Leslie is the author of Feminist Cities, which is a completely fascinating study. If you haven't read it, I'd heartily recommend it. And for those of us who, for those people who might not know how to conceive of urban planning through a feminist lens, it's easy to imagine a city that isn't very welcoming for somebody that doesn't have very much money, or for somebody that perhaps is less mobile, or those sorts of things. But it would be really useful to sort of think about this through with a gendered lens, and how cities can be very difficult to operate in simply as a woman, and what that means for housing.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me join you a little bit late today. This has been really interesting so far. So taking a kind of feminist lens on the city is about understanding the ways that cities have typically not been set up to really facilitate the kinds of multiple roles that typically still fall disproportionately on women. So the unpaid care labor of the home, of childcare, of the basics sort of domestic work, as well as paid work. Cities have not typically been very had their transportation network set up to really facilitate the kinds of multiple non-linear journeys that women tend to take throughout the day to drop off kids, to pick up the diapers, to go to their paid work, to go to their second job, to drop the kids at dad's for divorce or blended families, right? They function well for somebody moving in a linear journey from home to work, which has worked reasonably well for men. Women also tend to have less access to private transportation, so are more reliant on public transit. And of course, women, in being still disproportionately responsible for caring for others like children, the elderly, disabled people, accessibility in the urban environment is something that's really important, because any parent who's tried to take their stroller on a bus or to get into a subway system with small children knows that the city is just not really set up to facilitate your movement. So a feminist perspective is trying to understand the ways that the city could really do better to kind of incorporate care labor, to incorporate women's perspectives, and to understand what areas have been kind of lacking. And housing is certainly key. I think housing is a real cornerstone of any feminist vision of the city, especially affordable housing.
And Leslie, is there a city in the world that is more female friendly, or maybe a part of a city in the world that's more female friendly? Or is your sort of feminist urban design theory really at the moment just a theory rather than a reality?
I think we can see it in little pockets when we look at different cities. So Vienna, for example, had a gender mainstreaming program where they not only surveyed residents to find out what would make their lives easier and better, but they sort of constructed whole new neighborhoods that not only named the streets after women, but were more integrated in the kinds of services that people need, so that, you know, care labor, paid labor, and home were not these separate spheres that you couldn't kind of navigate. The mayor of Paris has been talking about the 15-minute city as a concept, not in explicitly feminist terms, but this is also a way that feminism can view the city as needing all of these services in closer proximity, so that it's not such a burden to have to do this kind of care labor. And in my experience traveling to cities in Scandinavia, like Copenhagen, for example, when you see this amazing kind of public transportation and cycling infrastructure that I think really allows for care labor to not just be easier for women, but to be redistributed throughout the family. So you see, you know, men cycling with their children and the grocery shopping and, you know, taking them to school and work. And I think that's one way that we can see the built environment kind of supporting gender equity and, as I say, a redistribution of that care labor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leslie. And I'm just noticing a comment in the chat from Tessa that really sort of hits home to me. Anybody who's sort of had young children small enough to be in a pushchair, in an era of London when the Routemaster buses, the open-backed buses, would career around the corner and you would hold on to your pushchair for dear life as you were fearful of your child sort of flying at the back of the bus. Definitely hits home. Let's take a question, if we can, from the floor. I've asked Donna House to come over to be a panelist. Donna, if you're able to turn your camera on, it'd be lovely to be able to see you as well. But you had a question about a specific situation in your city, that's right?
Yes, it's Donna House. Yes, I just want to say that it's something that I'm a civil engineer, and I live and practice in the Lower Mainland. And I was specifically interested in Kennedy Stewart's comment. I'm not an expert in the issue, and really I've only read about it through the newspapers and seeing it at hand. But I was really interested in how the city was trying to resolve that, and how we in the Lower Mainland could assist with it. And maybe it might be better if Kennedy spoke about it, because he's obviously a lot more briefed in the issue.
Thank you very much on it. And Kennedy, would you be able to respond to that question?
Is that the question about the empty lot in the city? Is that the? Sorry, I'm not quite sure what.
It's about Strathcona Park, and yes, and I think it's a, you know, I suppose my question comes from the point of view is that, what could we do, others in the Lower Mainland do, to assist Vancouver?
Right, okay, so for those from outside of Vancouver, the Strathcona Park is a public park in the east side of the city, which would be a mixed neighborhood. COVID-19 has caused an explosion of homelessness here in the city. For example, we have about 7,000 single room occupancy hotels in the city, and also a number of shelters. Due to physical distancing, the shelters are massively reduced in capacity, and our single room hotels can no longer have guests. So what that caused overnight was a whole bunch of folks, maybe up to 1,000 overnight, that had no place to sleep. And so what happened is these folks gravitated to various parts of the city and actually landed on national land, federal land, where the federal Port Authority issued an injunction. And these folks were all forced into kind of a local residential park. So we've been scrambling to try to find ways to get these folks sheltered as we move into the winter months. And that takes money. So, and as Gregory can tell you, it takes maybe 4 years to build permanent structures that are proper. So we've been trying to buy up used, vacant hotels, lease these, and it's, what can we do? We can keep pressuring the national and provincial governments to provide the funding and services that these folks need, because simply put, cities can't afford this, at least in Canada, where our main funding source is property tax. I landed maybe $50 million from the national government the other day, which is equivalent to an 8% property tax increase. So there's just no way for cities to with the funding tools we have to build this housing. And so unfortunately, as we wake up this morning, people are wet and cold in the park. We've heard talk about emergency shelters and refugee style camps. None of that really works. We have to get people into permanent housing, and that's the business after I get off this call today, is to try to get all that rolling. And we're close, but we're not quite there. And hopefully before Christmas, we'll get a lot of those people into not only into homes, but with the services they need to move their lives ahead.
Thank you very much, Mayor Stewart. And I'm so pleased that somebody put a comment in the chat, Jane Hurley, that it is a Stormtrooper portrait over your shoulder. I was worried my eyes were playing tricks on me, and you were like, no, it's a Stormtrooper.
No, it's actually indigenized. It's an indigenized Stormtrooper. So they've kind of stolen the Lucasfilm icon, and so I always try to, it's so important to hear reconciliation. I think I like the reverse cultural appropriation.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your answer to the question as well. I think we're going to take a question now that's principally for Gregory, from Nick, who I hope has been brought over. Nick Baudouin. Yes, I can see you. Hi, Nick.
Hi there.
Hiya. You had a question about the role of the architect who sort of has to try and make magic, but within the confines of a certain bureaucratic system kind of thing, if I understand your question right.
Yeah, no, I was interested in how, specifically for Gregory, because that's kind of the field that I'm interested in going in, kind of the intersection of where planning and architecture meet, but specifically kind of exactly what he's interested in, kind of where the activism part is able to kind of take part in architecture. So how specifically the architect is able to promote that justice aspect in their design, but still working within the confines of building and planning law, because that is kind of what the architect still has to deal with, right? They're not the ones making that law themselves. They can advocate within that space, but they still have to work within the confines of that. So I'm wondering how they're able to do that, how Gregory manages to do that, still working within those confines, still with that kind of justice and that, I guess, inclusion agenda.
Thanks, Nick. What do you think, Gregory?
I can try. Prior to our Woodwards project that we did, I did almost exclusively community-based work like social housing, work in the downtown east side, community centers. I wouldn't have lunch with most developers in town. And I had a profound, fear of being co-opted to the process and not being able to play a meaningful role in the larger urban issues that we have to deal with in our society. But through Woodwards, the project that we did, I came to understand that the success of changing our cities for meaningful ethical change really required individuals like myself and Unique, and Kennedy obviously has stepped up big time, to really participate in the profane world of development and economics and get an understanding of how those mechanisms work so that we can actually take control in a meaningful way. And even as an architect, I'm actually quite well versed in development, believe it or not, and I understand all the economic triggers and understand community amenity contributions and all the things that a developer would have to understand in order to make a building. As an architect, if you empower yourself with that skill set, if you study those things as well, you can actually make sure that you do good with the power, those tools, and make sure that every time you help a developer get an extra 10 stories, that there's 2 of them that are allocated towards something meaningful. And so I think it's really possible. And I think as a society, if we need to understand that, and that needs to be articulated in a way to common citizens so that they can actually get a sense of that this mayor and this council and this group of people now trying to build affordable housing have good intentions, and that it is not about gentrification, it's about authentic inclusivity. And I think an architect can participate in this as a hinge between the developer, the civic officials, the community, and upper levels of government even.
Thank you very much, Gregory. Gregory just used the word gentrification. I think I've only heard it twice so far today, although I did pop out and eat a tuna sandwich during the second sentence, so maybe I missed a couple of uses of it. I'd like to respond a little bit to a comment from Elizabeth. I can't see your surname, Elizabeth, in the chat, that talks about safety. And if I can come back to Nanjala to respond to it. I think that Elizabeth's talking about safety in cities from a sort of feminist perspective, but the excerpt from your book that I read, I think it was yesterday afternoon, all the days merge into one, you talk a lot about fear and fear while traveling, and fear when you find yourself in a place you haven't been before and where that comes from, and so on. And I just wonder about the cities are a frightening place for a lot of people, whether it's your home city or another one, and designing cities so that they are safe has a combination of things. There's practical things, and Elizabeth's talking about practical things like lighting. Can I walk home safely? Is the tube running late? All of those kinds of things, and women only carriages in Tokyo and so on. But there are other elements to safety too. Psychological safety, places where you feel that you're amongst your own, if you like. And I wonder if you might reflect on thinking about your experiences in cities all over the world. We hear a lot about how to make cities safer places. Do you have a sense of what the sort of key characteristics are that contribute to a safe urban space for the most people?
Yeah, I mean, I love the idea of feminist cities, because in my work as a researcher, I do a lot of work on feminist political science. And a core principle of feminist political science is to look at phenomena and ask yourself, how do women experience this? How do people who don't have power in this specific context experience this? And I think if a lot of cities started with that idea, planners, people who have power, politicians, how do women experience the cities? How do people who have disabilities experience our cities? I think, first of all, a lot of these livability indices would change a great deal. A lot of these, this is the best place in the world to live, indices would change a great deal if the person that we were assuming was at the center of this calculation was, for example, a disabled woman, or a person with a young child, a person who has to move a stroller around. There are places where I think of cities like Den Haag in the Netherlands, whereby a woman can go to the club, can go to a nightclub on a bike and come home at 2 a.m. on a bike and still feel a measure of safety and still feel a measure of, this is a place where I can move around and not be afraid. And a lot of that has to do with, things that Elizabeth has pointed out: lighting, adequate public transit, and especially for non-motorized transport, for people to have options, for people who don't have cars to have options and to be able to move around, without having to dodge dark corners and having to, move around in constantly looking over their shoulder, to have access to a meaningful standard of public services. A big problem, for example, in Nairobi, where I live, is water, and women having to buy water for 50 cents, 5 cents, or whatever every day. But what that means is that at night, if you're living in an informal settlement and you've already locked the door, a lot of people don't open the door until the sun comes up the next day. So if you finish your water supply before sunset or after sunset, and you don't have time to go and get more water, that's it. That's the water that you have. Whatever is inside your house is the water that you have. And that creates a real problem, for women, in terms of security, in terms of having access to adequate sanitation and health and things like that. On a philosophical sort of meta level, I think that's where we begin. We start to imagine how women experience our cities. I'm a runner, for example. I run, and there are cities where I can show up with my running shoes and running gear, and I can hit the pavement every morning and not, without hesitations. And some of them are cities that you might not expect, Antananarivo, Madagascar, although with the caveat that there's not enough pavements. They're places where you wouldn't assume that a person would have that experience, but they do. And it has more to do with the ways in which the city is kept open and kept accessible for people, and less to do with money and wealth and prosperity in the tradition, in the more neoliberal sense of the word. But then there are cities where I can't do that because it's harassment, it's being followed, it's again, dark corners. The parks are not, well lit. The parks are not well maintained. So there's all of this overgrowth, and there's this sense that if I go into that park, I don't know if I'm going to be able to come out. So yeah, I think from a planning perspective, the cities that I've had the best experience with are the ones where I think that there is that recognition that if we provide the best services for the most vulnerable, then everybody benefits. Then the entire city becomes a much more hospitable and a much more welcoming place.
Thank you, Nanjala. That's helpful. I could see Leslie smiling and nodding encouragingly as you were talking just then. So Leslie, again, super unfair question, but we're a newsroom at Tortoise, and our job is to look for stories that aren't told, stories that need telling. We're trying to uncover things that other newsrooms have missed or are missing. If we were going to go searching for stories to tell about modern cities that aren't well known, and lots of them are well known, they're sort of latently accepted almost, lots of the bad stories about cities, what are some of the questions that you think as journalists we could or should be asking?
Well, right now, particularly in the context of the pandemic, some of the things that have kind of bubbled up to the forefront would be questions around, as I mentioned before, care labor, right? Who is doing the work that literally keeps the city functioning? We're being asked in many places around the world right now to risk our lives to reopen this thing called the economy, right? That we've kind of reified as this sort of thing out there. But what allows that to function even in non-pandemic times is all of the unpaid and of course underpaid exploited labor, predominantly done by women and people of color, and not supporting that through the ways that our cities are set up, through living wages, through good mobility, through collective spaces of providing care, is a real contributor to, I think, of what has made this so much of a crisis, right? And which raises the question of, what are we going to go back to? Are we going to go back to normal? Is normal sustainable? I think it's shown now that this has not been sustainable. So I guess one of the stories that I'd want to uncover is very much what is hidden in the city, and what is hidden, for example, by the single family home, what is hidden by traditional gender roles and assumptions about who does what kind of labor. So in some ways, we can always keep coming back to housing as an issue. The form of housing that is so dominant is really effective at keeping this kind of, I'll just call it exploitation, hidden and invisible, and it allows a certain kind of status quo to flourish. And maybe it's only in moments like a pandemic crisis that we're like, oh, this status quo is actually very shaky and might not carry us through all of the crises that we are, currently experiencing.
Fab. Thank you very much. Indeed, I know that officially we're out of time, but I would like to just come back to Mayor Kennedy, if he's still there. I don't know if he is. Yeah, he's there. There you are. Just before we close the session, obviously you are in a position of power in Vancouver. We've heard from Gregory that you're doing a great job at plugging away at this, and that it's hard yards, as you say. It's a hard-won fight. There's no magic wand. I wonder if there's something, if you were going to, I'm sitting at the moment in a modern flat in a part of London that is in the process of being redeveloped. I can see across the way old houses that are going to be torn down, and they're going to be replaced by the flat in which I'm living. I feel guilty about the environment in which I live, although I understand the context. So I wonder if you might sort of close out with a bit of a comment on in trying to improve the city for everybody. Is it possible to do that without disadvantaging somebody?
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the discussion of the feminist city and intersectional cities, because I think that's what will make a difference. Is, look, I'm the 40th white male mayor in a row here in the city. We need diversity on our councils, and right now we have out of the 11 council spots, we have 8 women, which makes a huge difference to how we discuss about planning. So childcare comes up every time we're looking at major developments. And I think if we have the same kind of diversity in terms of class and income, that will lead to different planning decisions. So instead of a whole table full of rich white males figuring out how to best maximize profits, we can think about how we can bend the market, because essentially that's what we've got to work with to make cities that are fully inclusive. And in fact, I find, as Gregor was saying, sometimes it's, you don't want to sit down with evil developers, but actually when you do, you realize that they will listen to new ideas too. So it's about conversations, but it's having people other than that look like me sitting around in power. So I appreciate the discussion this morning, but it's, you won't get diverse cities that work for everyone until you have diverse councils and diverse governments that work for everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you. What a fabulous point to end on. And I hope that I've been successful in what I wanted to do in this session, which is to just change the lens a little bit in the way that we think about urban life and where it's going. We're 3 minutes over time, so not too bad. Thank you so much, of course, to all our invited experts for the session today, to Mayor Stewart, to Gregory, to Leslie, and to Nanjala. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you have too. Thank you, of course, to everybody who's sticking with it, to those of you who dialed in from Canada, who are readers of the Global Mail, our partners for the summit. Hang around, and we will be back at 4 o'clock for our next session, which I should know what it is, but I've closed. Hold on, let me find out. It is the 15-minute city. Much talk about it. Let's discover more about it at 4 o'clock. Time to go and have a cup of tea. And thank you very much to everybody. Bye-bye.